Hello and welcome to this, the latest in a series of reports brought to you by Deloitte. My name is Robert Bruce and I'm a financial journalist. Over the last 25 years, one man has probably been the most famous accountant on the planet. First, he spent a decade bringing order to the world of UK accounting standards. As a result, a newspaper headline asked if he was Britain's most hated accountant. Then he spent a decade as the inaugural chairman of the International Accounting Standards Board. He patiently worked towards the creation, implementation and acceptance of a single global set of international financial reporting standards. At the end of that decade, financial reporting was, with some exceptions, pretty much uniform around the world. The Economist magazine dubbed him the world's first rock and roll accountant, and he was inducted into the Accounting Hall of Fame. Now, as chairman of the trustees of the International Valuation Standards Council, he is trying to bring uniformity to the world of asset and business valuation. He is, of course, Sir David Tweedie. David, could you start by just talking us through the work of the IVSC?
Well, the IVSC is an organisation that operates, if you like, in parallel with the IASB. During the financial crisis, I was a member of the Financial Stability Forum, as it was then, now board, in my role as chairman of IASB. And probably 4 or 5 weeks after Lehman's, we were at a meeting and markets were crashing. I have never smelt such fear in a room as I did that day. I think many of them there, the senior treasury ministers, central bankers and so on, felt the whole capitalist system was going down. And in the course of it, I was asked, well, what are you going to do about the fact that all these markets are frozen? You know, what are you going to do about fair values? And my reaction was, well, there's people out there doing this. You know, as a standard setter, we'd mandated fair value and we just assumed the fair values were fair. People were doing it. But of course, when the market froze, there was no transactions. So people were wondering what was going on. And I discovered then there was nobody out there doing this. And so we had to cobble together with the Americans ad hoc working party, consisted of auditors, bankers, credit rating agencies, regulators, so on. And we came out within about 4 or 5 weeks. This is what you do in a financial crisis when the markets freeze. You don't take fire sales, and this is how you do it. That worried me because I'd assumed that valuers, who I knew did real estate, properties, mortgage lending, valuations and so on, and I knew from my old days at KPMG that we did business valuations. You know, you valued companies, you valued brands as it was in those days, and that was all done. The whole area that wasn't touched was financial instruments, which was probably the most important area that was coming up there. So the work of the Valuation Standards Council is really to try and set international standards for property, for business valuations, and now gradually moving into financial instruments. So that's setting those standards as the target.
Do you not find a great sense of déjà vu, trying once again to try and bring the world's different bodies and organisations into line?
I do, Robert. It's a bit like when I started at the IASB. We had the old IVSC, and the IVSC was very worthy, but slightly irrelevant. It did great work, but nobody used the standards. And in a way, the IVSC is in a similar position to that. You know, it does. It's got a committee, a standards committee. It meets 3 times a year, like the old IVSC did. It produces these standards. Now the question is, who uses them? And I feel exactly the same way about valuation standards as I did about accounting standards. If we have one method of valuing in Britain, why should it be different in America or Australia, France, or wherever? We should all do it the same way. Whichever's the best one, we should all have it. I believe that for accounting, and I think it's exactly the same for valuation. We shouldn't have different valuations. And if we have IFRS worldwide, and we're having big differences in valuations, we are going to get big differences in accounts for exactly the same transactions. So that's in a way where we felt that it is as it was before, but can we bring them closer together?
And you've also talked about the likelihood of systemic risk from the state of balance sheets as a result of this lack of uniformity. I mean, how great a danger do you think that is? And what can you do and what are you doing to try and make that easier?
Well, the big problem that we discovered was that financial information is often proprietary, held by banks, and it's not released because they have their own transactions, their own derivatives, and it's here. And we're finding that these financial institutions are getting quite different, wide variations in the value of these identical instruments. Now that instantly worries you because if, and as we know they are, some of them are hugely different. You've got a situation there that, well, what about the balance sheet? How reliable is the balance sheet? Secondly, the balance sheet clearly affects the income statement, so how reliable is the profit number? And thirdly, if we talk about financial stability, which is based on capital buffers, based on balance sheet numbers, are these rubbish? Or do they mean something? But if you've got a bank that values twice as high as another one, then it's showing 3% capitals, maybe only 1.5%. And that's the sort of area that we just haven't got the numbers. I think there's a lacuna in the regulatory system at the moment, which is a danger to the financial system. It's a reputational risk for regulators and also for auditors, because we know auditors are accepting big differences in these values. Now, we will never get the values down to 3 decimal places, but when you've got a huge range, we can narrow it. If you've got somewhere at 5–10%, okay, but it's way above that at the moment for certain instruments.
So what can you do about that?
Well, what we were proposing to do is, with the regulators and the auditors and the banks, get together with a round table with the accounting standard setters, and then sort of say, okay, what exactly are the problems? What are causing this? And we need the regulators in a way to get the information divulged and get it out on the table. This is what's causing the differences. Is it I use one model, you use a different one? Are they all acceptable, or some of them should just be banned? What about the assumptions? Are there certain assumptions that are really off the scale and they should be cut? Where does the data come from? So what is causing all the differences? And can we then just bring a boundary around some of these things, which is models, assumptions, data, so that people are using the same sort of information and getting similar sort of numbers. So the outliers are just removed from the scene.
But isn't there a sense of déjà vu here? You're trying to get all these people to do something, and the problem, as you and I know from past history, is actually getting everybody to do the same thing and follow exactly the same standards, and make sure that things are aligned right the way around the globe.
Well, that exactly is the problem. We've started off by getting the major valuation institutes, which are mainly on the business side or on the real estate side, to come together, and we've got a memorandum of understanding saying we're going to spend the next 3 years trying to get all these together. So if the Canadian standard's better, IVSC should have it, and so on, vice versa. So that's the start on the business and on the real estate side. Financial instruments, primitive. There are no financial instrument valuation organizations out there. So they're unregulated. How do we tackle that? Well, the first thing we have to do, I think, is get the group together and let's start agreeing what the priorities for standards are, getting them to buy in, and the regulators can help them to buy in, because if the regulator says, well, either you do it or we do it, then I think hearts and minds follow a situation like that. And I think the same thing goes in the sense that the banks, if they said, well, we'll set our own standards, nobody would believe it. It'd be unacceptable. And similarly, the auditors couldn't set the standards for their clients because they would not like being regulated by that. So it really needs the whole industry to coming together to do it that way and find out what we think is a reasonable answer. So that's how we intend to try and get it done.
How long will this take?
Well,
what's your horizon, time horizon?
I would like to see 2015 first quarter. Let's get it moving. Let's see where the areas of divergence are, what we can do about it, and who should do it. I mean, some of it might just be a regulator says stop doing that. Other bits might be well, more information is required. ISB. You can deal with that in accounts. And other bits might be, no, you need a standard on how to value this particular type of derivative. That's the IVSC's role. So we see, and we've got a protocol with the ISB, they say when you use fair value, the form of value is to be, and we then can say, and this is how you do it. So it's all of us involved in it. So I'd like to see it start. It'll take quite a few years to roll out the main standards in this area. And of course, in the financial sector, things are always evolving, so it'll be a constant moving up as you know. But I think the real danger is that when Lehman's went down, you found that JP Morgan walked away from them. They wouldn't accept Lehman's collateral. They said, your values are too high, we want more collateral. Bank of America came in and exactly the same thing happened. They just looked at Lehman's values and just ran a mile. And that's why Lehman's crashed eventually. But even their own traders, dealing with the same instruments in different trading desks, Lehman's own desks were completely different values. So the whole thing was a shambles. And we just cannot have that happening again. So I do feel this is a chance to nip this in the bud before it happens, and before some company blows up, taking a few others with it, and some auditor splattered all over the Financial Times or Wall Street Journal, and some regulators look pretty stupid as well.
How do you do this? Because in the days when I used to interview you, when you were head of the UK Accounting Standards Board, the one thing I always asked, and you always were keen to provide, were the people who were against this. Where were the obstacles? Where were the difficulties? Where are they in this new scenario?
Well, if you're an aggressive valuer and you value at the high end, you're going to have higher profits, your balance sheet will look better, your capital ratios will look better, and probably your bonuses will look better. That's where the opposition is.
Mm-hmm. And how are you going to cope with that? How are you going to...
I think that's where you need the regulators. You know, you're going to have to bring people in to force them to use the standards. And we need the others to get together to really come forward with the idea of saying, well, this is a reasonable way of doing this. And then the regulators say, and now you've all got to do it. And that was in a way the beauty of the ASB had the review panel behind them, which forced people in. The ISB had the security regulators, and they had the push from the European Commission to start with, and then gradually it spread worldwide. We haven't got that yet, and that's what's needed. It's the backing from the authorities, if you like, to get it done.
And are the signs of you getting the backing?
Well, I think we're quite a small organisation. We don't have to be a big one. Nothing like the ISB is. The ISB, about 160 staff. We could probably do this with about 15 to 20, because basically, if you use volunteers, which the ISB doesn't, because it's a full-time board, it can be done much more cheaply. And it's a case of, we've now got a review going on to sort of say, well, how do we get more funding, how do we get more staff to do it, and so on, and that's going on at this very moment.
Talking to people at the ISB and elsewhere, I mean, how come the valuation isn't covered by, for example, IFRS 13? Surely, are you not going to be inventing a system which will turn out further down the line to be in opposition and provide problems that at the moment don't exist in getting this all to work?
Well, that's an excellent question. The answer is no, I don't think we'll have a problem. The reason is that, in a way, I suppose I was fairly naive as chairman of ISB. I assumed IFRS 13, there was a fair value and people were just going to use it. And then, of course, we discover there's one fair value here and there's another one there for exactly the same thing. And that's where the problem came in. So suddenly you realize that where you think you're standardizing, with the range of variation, you're not really. And IFRS 13, what it does is say, this is how you do a fair value, but it doesn't go into the detail that you're required to actually get the numbers shrunk to an acceptable level of agreement. And that's where I think the IVSC comes in, because we're not experts as accountants in valuation. And we've done some, and most of us are trained how to value a business and so on. Financial instruments, here's the guys with the pointy heads and whirling eyes, that astrophysicists and so on. Well, wait a minute, what are you doing in this little black box of yours? And that's where we really just got to bring this out and put a light in it and see what's happening.
And how do you put that light in there?
Well, I think it's by getting an industry agreement. We just have to come to the view that ultimately certain things are not acceptable. I remember one chap saying to me, there's only 3 people in the world can value these instruments. And I thought, well, how do you know you're right? And if there's only 3 can do it, maybe this is too dangerous an instrument to have out there, if nobody can sort of take the values of these things. But I think, for example, some of these, the differences must be way over the audit materiality levels. And that, for an auditor, is very, very worrying, I would have thought. How come they can say that that's a fair presentation or a true and fair view, and this one is as well? And they're completely different. So I think the auditing profession has got an issue on its hands.
Are they assisting you and helping you?
Yes, they are, and they're involved in the review that we're doing, sort of how can we get the standards, because I think the IVSC standards, one of the views is that they're a bit too high level. You know, it's all right being principle based, but you know, if you're at 39,000 feet, you don't want to be at 0 feet either, but you've got to be some level where you can operationalise the standards, so you have a sort of level of acceptability in the answers, and if the answers are all over the place, well, you haven't really got a standard, and we just want to make sure our standards are at that level.
Where do you find the appetite? After all this time bringing UK accounting standards into order, doing the same with international ones, I think you ought to go back to your who's who entry and put down amongst your recreations something like herding cats. Or
herding cats, yes. I think the answer is anger, really. It's just, you think, this is outrageous. I mean, how can you value these things completely differently? It just doesn't make any sense to me. But the other thing I'm really concerned about is I think that the financial system is at risk when you've got these valuations. Are we looking at a bank that looks okay, but in fact isn't? It looks okay because of the valuations at the top end of the scale. And if you actually use the more conservative valuations, you get a totally different picture. And I find that totally unacceptable. And as a standard setter, I think, you know, I accepted that sort of thing, not realising that was going on. Now, having seen it's going on, I want something done about it. And if I don't finish it, I want somebody else to finish it.
So David Tweedie, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure, Roy.